By the way, I got to thank Casper because I came into the weekend with a tremendously sore throat. I had a golf ball stuck on this side of my throat, at least that's how it felt. And he laid hands on it and prayed over it. And brother, it is far and away better than it was 24 hours ago. We were contemplating a trip to the ER, but thankfully that was not necessary. Casper included in song there a phrase, a saying my dad used to like to tell people: if you ask Derek the time, he tells you how to build a watch. Which I guess is, it's good that I went into broadcasting as a career. Not so good if you're trying to deliver the last talk at a conference without having people look at their watches and wondering if they're going to make their flights on time. So I have cut a lot out of the presentation today in researching what will be a book, The Great Inception, Satan's Psyops from Eden to Armageddon. So if it looks like you're getting just the skeleton of a presentation without the connective tissue, that's why. So not appearing in this presentation today will be the Mesopotamian watchers. They knew about them before the Hebrews did. Ophidian, snake-like figurines, which date back to the early days of Mesopotamia. Eye idols, E.T. phone home. Mesopotamian cone heads. Yes, 5,000 years before the ones in Peru that L.A. Marzulli is focusing on. Aleister Crowley and Cthulhu, all of them are connected but will not be appearing in today's presentation due to time limitations. The title of the presentation comes from the 2010 sci-fi film Inception. In that film, Leonardo DiCaprio's character plays a man who's developed a technology to implant information in the dreams of subjects without their knowledge. This allows them to manipulate the behavior of those subjects. This is a classic example of a psyop, a psychological operation. Psyops defined as planned operations to convey selected information and indicators to audiences to influence their emotions, motives, and objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. The sons of God who rebelled, variously called gods, watchers, demons, B'nai Elohim, spirit guides, extraterrestrials, ancient astronauts, have been waging a massive psychological operations campaign against the human race since the beginning of history. They've woven a web of false religions, false doctrines, false histories, and false prophecies, most especially, to deceive, delude, and destroy the human race. Now, before I jump into the meat of this talk, I want to thank some men who've been very influential. No, I want to thank my best friend. Sharon? I can't tell you how many times I'll stumble on something that I think is really cool and awesome and nobody's ever heard of it before and say, Sharon, did you know? And she'll smile and nod and then say, did you not listen to my talk in Chicago in 2012? And I am grateful for that. But these are some books that I found extremely useful in pulling together the information for this talk in particular. David Rohl, whom you are familiar with if you watch the film Patterns of Evidence, his books Legend and Lords of Avaris especially. Peter D. Goodgame, The Second Coming of Antichrist. Chris White, False Christ, and Islamic Antichrist Debunked. Dr. Timothy Furnish, a scholar of Islamic history and eschatology. His books 10 Years Captivation with the Mahdi's Camps and Sects, Lies, and the Caliphate. Buy those. Extremely educational. Chris Putnam, The Supernatural Worldview. Chris Putnam and Tom Horn's new book, The Final Roman Emperor, and especially Dr. Michael Heiser's The Unseen Realm. Get that one, because that one is key to understanding the spiritual war. Now, there are 3 points I want to make today. First of all, the supernatural realm is at war. The gods of the ancient world have rebelled against Yahweh. The war was ignited because those gods refused to accept the status that God has granted humanity inside his family. The war began and will end on a mountain. Those mountains are Eden and Zion. And the rebellious gods have been waging a psyop campaign since the beginning. The movie The Usual Suspects paraphrases a line from the French author Charles Baudelaire. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. That is just one aspect of their psyop. Likewise, the powers and principalities aligned against us have fed us misinformation and disinformation to confuse us about the nature of this supernatural war, about the stakes in this war, about whether there even is a war. And as a result, when the Antichrist arrives, as Jesus prophesied, the world will welcome him with open arms, including many who call themselves Christian. Now let's understand very clearly, the enemy will use deception to get us to believe a lie, any lie. He doesn't matter. They don't care which one. Just don't believe the one thing that's true. The way, the truth, and the life. Jesus Christ is coming back, and when he does, he will be in the clouds with power and great glory. The Bible repeats that phrase multiple times. Anyone else who claims to be Messiah, if his feet are touching the ground, he's lying. Holy mountains are key to understanding this war. Mountains have always been sacred to humanity. There are holy mountains all over the planet, and that's part of the psyop, because there is, in fact, only one mountain that is truly holy. We can define and divide the phases of the war into 7 phases, each one defined by a particular mountain. We'll take these in roughly chronological order. Mountain number 1, of course, is Eden, the original holy mountain. Now you're saying, wait, Eden, the Garden of Eden. Yes, it was a garden on a mountain. Ezekiel 28. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Skipping down, I placed you, you were on the holy mountain of God. Eden was a mountain with a well-watered garden. It was the seat of the gods. It's where the divine council met. Adam and Eve were part of the divine council on God's holy mountain. This is where the enemy played its first psyop. You shall be as gods. This is one they keep using over and over again. You know why? Because we're stupid, and it keeps working. Adam and Eve lost immortality, got kicked out of the garden, kicked off the mountain, and out of the divine council. Mountain number 2, Mount Hermon. Elevation 9,200 feet, northern edge of the Golan Heights, the border between Israel and Syria. This mountain has been sacred for most of human history. It was sacred at least as far back as the Babylonian period, and maybe even further. In the old Babylonian copy of the Gilgamesh epic, Hermon and Lebanon recorded as the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki was the Sumerian pantheon. So now we're back almost 5,000 years in human history that it was known that Mount Hermon was a holy mountain. According to the books of Enoch and Jubilees, of course, Hermon is where the 200 watchers descended and began to convert with human women. And from these unions, of course, came the Nephilim, the giants, the men of renown who were of old. The Nephilim pillaged the earth, endangering humanity physically, but also genetically. So Yahweh sent a flood, rid the world of all flesh, except for the 8 in the ark and the animals on the ark. And the watchers committed that sin, according to Peter and Jude in the New Testament, are in chains, in darkness, until the judgment of that great day. But here's another key point. Discovered an academic paper from about 45 years ago, a scholar named Edward Lipinski. Mount Hermon was also the holy mountain of El. El was the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. In fact, as part of a psyop, the enemy managed to insinuate the word El as sort of a generic term meaning God, as in Elohim. In fact, there are scholars today who are amazed that we Christians are so stupid we don't realize we're actually worshiping El, the Canaanite god, because it's the same name, different god. El lived on Mount Hermon with his consort Asherah. You've heard of the Asherim, and their 70 sons. The 70 sons of El. The 70 B'nai Elohim. Remember that number, 70. We will refer to it again. Mountain number 3 is the artificial mountain Babel. The name is from the Hebrew word meaning confusion, but the Hebrew prophets loved to play with language. They liked to take a word that meant kind of what the word meant of the thing that they were trying to describe, but meant what they really wanted it to mean. I'm babbling now, in fact. Babel is taken from the Akkadian words Bab Elu, meaning gate of God or gate of the gods. Now, there's an important detail about the Tower of Babel, an important point that I need to make, and that is that the Tower of Babel was not, in fact, at Babylon. Nimrod, remembered as the builder of the Tower of Babel, Josephus, other ancient traditions record this. The best guess is that Nimrod lived somewhere between 3,500 and 3,000 BC. Genesis 10:10 tells us that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Shinar is Sumer. Erech is the city of Uruk. Uruk, the center of Nimrod's kingdom, was so influential in history that we still call that part of the world by that name today, except we pronounce it Iraq. The thing is, Babylon was northwest of Uruk. Sorry, Casper. I get a little more mobile than you might have expected. Babylon wasn't founded until about 2300 BC. That's 700 years best away from Nimrod. Now, scholars have also learned that the name Babylon was interchangeable with the names of other cities in ancient Mesopotamia, in ancient Sumer. For example, Eridu, E-R-I-D-U, which the Sumerians believed was the very first city ever built. Eridu was so important in ancient Sumer that 2,500 years after Nimrod, in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the kings of Babylon still referred to themselves as Lugal Nun Ki, king of Eridu. So what's the deal with Eridu? It's located in southeast Mesopotamia on what was then the shores of the Persian Gulf. 7,000 years of silt has moved the shoreline just a bit. But it's also the site of the largest and probably the oldest ziggurat in Mesopotamian history. See Eridu right there. The very first city in history, and scholars agree that this is probably so. According to archaeologists, it was probably founded around 5400 BC, almost 7,500 years ago. According to the legend, Eridu was built by the god Enki. Enki. It was the site of Enki's temple, the E-Abzu, or the House of the Deep Waters. The temple sat above the Abzu, which is a subterranean chamber, which was the source of the sweet waters that were necessary for life. It was there that Enki took the salt water from the Persian Gulf and turned them into the fresh waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. He's usually depicted with two streams, one for each river flowing out of his shoulders. He was also credited with bringing everything that mankind needed for civilization, the secrets of reading, writing, arithmetic, and so forth, music. Enki is a compound word in Sumerian. En, the prefix, means Lord. Ki, Ki, means earth. So Enki was Lord of the earth. Does this sound familiar? Anyone? The God of this world? Perhaps a title that Jesus applied to somebody. Paul also called an entity the ruler of this world, the God of this world. Anyone who he might have been talking about? Satan, yes, okay, that's very possible. Oh yeah, and Abzu was a word from which we get the English word abyss. So Enki, the founder of Eridu, which influenced Mesopotamian history for 5,000 years at least, founded by the god of the abyss. Here's another piece to the puzzle. Nimrod, second generation after the flood. In the Sumerian king list, the second king of Eridu after the flood was a guy named Enmerkar, the second king of Uruk, which of course was the center of Nimrod's kingdom. Enmerkar is also a compound word. En means Lord, the suffix kar means hunter. Enmerkar, meaning Enmer, the hunter, as in a mighty hunter before the Lord. So now we know who this guy was, and the history books, the Hebrews, of course, doing what they love to do with language, took the name Enmer, N-M-R, remember, no vowels in ancient Hebrew, and they added a D on the end, turned Enmer the hunter into Lord Mer the rebel, or Lord Rebel, because it sounds like the Hebrew word marad, which means rebel. Now, In about the year 2000 BC, somebody carved on tablets a poem called Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata. Arata was a kingdom located somewhere in the region. Scholars still don't know for sure where. Could be Armenia, could be Iran. But the point of this poem is that it records the basics of the Tower of Babel story. Enmerkar muscled this kingdom of Arata to get building materials to rebuild the temple of Enki at Eridu. Oh yes, it also remembers that before this, the whole world worshipped one God using one language until Enki confused their speech. And the god that wanted to send the flood, by the way, was the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, Enlil, lord of the storm. Because humans made so much noise, he couldn't sleep at night. So he was going to commit genocide and wipe out the whole planet. And he commanded the other gods not to tell the humans, but Enki, the trickster god, told a wall, "Oh, wall, if I were you, I would build me a boat and float away from this flood that's coming." So he didn't exactly, very Clintonian when you think about it. Told the wall because the hero of the Sumerian flood story just happened to be standing on the other side of that wall, see. So Enki was the hero of the story, saved humanity in opposition of the wishes of the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. A double psyop, because not only did the ancient Sumerians get a twisted version of the Tower of Babel story, but scholars over the last 150 years, as they dug up these tablets and deciphered them, translated them, now have evidence to say, you know, those Hebrews, they just stole their entire religion from ancient Sumer. Like alone amongst the people in all of history of the earth, the Hebrews are the only ones who couldn't come up with their own cosmology. At Eridu, archaeologists have found 18 construction layers to this temple to Enki. Some of them are below an 8-foot thick layer of silt from a flood. The most impressive layer, Temple 1, a massive structure. This is an artist's recreation of it. Huge temple, massive platform, even bigger foundation that rose up to the level of the temple. They're not quite sure what it would have looked like when it was finished, because at the peak of ancient Sumerian archaeological or architectural achievement, not only was the construction abandoned, the entire city of Eridu was suddenly and completely abandoned. Why, you might ask? Genesis chapter 11. The Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Pattern of evidence. Well, to sum up, Enmerkar, Nimrod, tried to rebuild and expand an ancient temple to the god of the abyss, the Bab Elu, gate of the gods. What was really going on there at the supernatural level? I don't know. But Yahweh apparently thought it was important enough for him to personally intervene. And there were consequences. Not only did Yahweh scatter the people across the face of the earth, he told mankind essentially, okay, look, you don't want to deal with me? From now on you deal with my subordinates, the lesser Elohim, the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. Deuteronomy 32, beginning at verse 8. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. This is from the English Standard Version. The ESV follows the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls in rendering that verse sons of God instead of sons of Israel, which is how you may have heard this verse previously. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense textually when you think about it, since Israel, Jacob, wasn't born for another 12 to 1500 years after the Tower of Babel. Again, the Septuagint was translated by Jewish scholars about 200 BC. This is how they took the original Hebrew. The borders of the people, geographically and spiritually, fixed by God after the Tower of Babel, according to the number of the sons of God. Now, look at Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations. Any guess as to how many nations are in the Table of Nations? 70.
Oh, man.
Coincidence? Coincidence? No. These 70 B'nai Elohim, sons of God, apparently decided to present themselves as gods to the nations after they were divided across the earth. And this is where the concept of holy ground and national deities begins. Molech for the Ammonites, Chemosh for the Moabites, Dagon for the Philistines, Yahweh, Israel, his allotted portion. Now, if you want to read how that worked out for the fallen, just read Psalm 82. This is really amazing when you get down into this and read it with a fresh set of eyes. Psalm 82, beginning at verse 1. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Most commentators will try to make the gods out as the judges of Israel. But that doesn't make verse 6 then sensible, where God is telling the gods, like men you shall die. If he was addressing human leaders, of course the response will be, well, duh. No, he is addressing B'nai Elohim, divine beings who presented themselves as small g gods to the rest of the nations. God telling them, you're not judging rightly, you're going to die. Moving on, mountain number 4. This is where the tables begin to turn. Moses hears the call, Sinai. God appears to Moses there, tasks him with bringing Israel out of Egypt, and this is so cool. I've been waiting months to talk about this. The way God has Moses do it sends a very clear message to the gods of Egypt. Exodus 12. They've had all of the plagues, the final plague, where God takes the firstborn. Not only is Yahweh striking all the firstborn of Egypt, on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. How likely is it that Yahweh was telling Moses, I'm just going to crush all those lifeless blocks of wood and stone, those idols? No. Supernatural entities who had manifested as gods in Egypt, Yahweh saying, tonight, a reckoning. On the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. Now let's look at Exodus 14. This is the cool part. Exodus 14. Sharon and I record a weekly Bible study, and we stumbled on this a few months ago, and I was like, wait, what? Yahweh said, what? Tell the people of Israel to turn back. This is, now, they're leaving Egypt, okay? And Pharaoh's changed his mind, and he sent out the cavalry after them. The last guy in the column of Israelites turns, and he sees the dust rising off the desert sand as the ancient Near East's most fearsome professional army is chasing them. And the word comes from the front of the column. Moses says, we've got to turn around. What? Turn back and camp in front of Pi Hahiroth between Migdal and the sea. In front of Baal Zephon, you shall encamp facing it by the sea. Now this begs some questions. Why did God tell him to turn around? Why did he tell the Israelites to encamp facing Baal Zephon? What is Baal Zephon? What is Baal doing in Egypt? He's a Canaanite god, right? Well, yeah, kinda. But then this is the part of history that never makes it into our churches on Sunday mornings. You see, beginning in about 1750 BC, give or take 100 years, a Semitic people called the Hyksos by modern scholars. That's a Greek version of an Egyptian term that means leaders of foreign lands, rulers of foreign lands. Basically took over Lower Egypt, which is northern Egypt, and they ruled there for a couple hundred years. Well, guess what? Baal was their national god. So the Hyksos came in, settled at Avaris, which again, if you saw Tim Mahoney's presentation or see the movie, you know Avaris was the city where all of the Semitic people dwelt in Egypt for a couple hundred years. And they worshiped Baal there. Now, we don't know if the Hyksos were still around at the time of the Exodus, but we do know that Baal was still there. And by the way, for you scholars, I know there's a glottal stop there. It's supposed to be Baal, like uh-oh. But I'm using Baal because that's what we're all used to, so just wanted you to know that I knew. Now, during the period of the Hyksos, Baal was also identified with the Egyptian god Set. Set was the chaos god, the god of the desert, the god of foreigners. Apparently a good fit for Baal. Now, today we think of Set, represented here, as this weird evil god with the anteater head that killed his brother Osiris and cut him up into 14 parts. But Set wasn't always evil. Wasn't always evil. Back in the day, he was the god of the rulers of northern Egypt. And apparently after being invaded in the first millennium BC and conquered by the Nubians and the Assyrians and the Persians, the god of foreigners wasn't quite as welcome around the pyramids anymore, you know. But during the period of time when Baal Set was the preeminent god in northern Egypt, and this went for about 400 years, he was there long after the Hyksos had run out of the country. In fact, we know that Baal Set was worshipped at least until the time of Ramses II. You know, Ramses the Great, Yul Brynner, because Ramses the Great set up a stela dedicated to Set on the 400th anniversary of Set doing something. Scholars aren't quite sure what. This is what it looked like. But if we date Ramses the Great to about 1350 BC, give or take, backtrack 400 years, that would be about the time that Baal Set arrived in Egypt. Just about the time that the house of Israel settled there. Coincidence? Coincidence? No. I thought I had a bunch of coincidence theorists out here. And here's the other thing. When Yahweh led the Israelites out of Egypt, he ordered them to turn around specifically to cross at that point on the Red Sea, opposite a point sacred to Baal, Baal Zephon, which, by the way, Zephon just happens to be the name of Baal's holy mountain, 500 miles north of the Nile Delta. Coincidence? Coincidence? No, this was a supernatural smackdown. He told him to cross right there for that specific reason. Baal was the god of storms. He was the god who had conquered the chaos god of the sea. Baal was the god of maritime navigation. So even if you discount the supernatural aspect of the Red Sea crossing, wall of water on the right, wall of water on the left, and just look at the symbolism of what was being accomplished here. Baal, god of the sea, huh? Boom. If they had microphones in the 15th century BC, that's where Yahweh would have dropped it right there. Boom, and walk off stage. He was not only delivering Israel from the hand of Pharaoh, he was delivering Israel from the hand of Baal. So, the Israelites escape Egypt. They make their way to Sinai. Moses receives the law. And then notice at Sinai, the warning God gives to the people. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. Holy ground. Holy as in the sense of taboo, as in the sense of don't touch it or you'll die. The same type of warning that God applied to the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. And for the same reason. This is another thing I had to cut from the presentation. You'll find it in the book, how the tabernacle is like a holy mountain. Moses got the law. Then Yahweh says, okay, I want you to come back up the mountain. I'm going to give you instructions on how to build the tabernacle. But first, he says, oh yes, when you come, bring Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel. Bring them up the mountain. So Moses, Aaron's sons, and 70 of the elders go up the mountain, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness, and he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. Do you see the significance of what happened there? For the first time since Eden, mankind was back on the holy mountain of God and in his presence. How many elders of Israel? 70. How many sons of El on Mount Hermon? 70. Coincidence? No. course, Baal wasn't finished. If you can't beat him, lie to him. Moses went up there 40 days and they created a golden calf. Aaron says, I just jumped out of the fire. Guess which gods in the Canaanite pantheon were typically represented by bulls and calves? Baal and El. Coincidence? No. All right. This mountain climbing is thirsty work. Excuse me just a moment. See, in radio broadcasting, you don't have people looking at you. It's not nearly as nerve-wracking. Mountain number 5, Baal's holy mountain, Mount Zaphon. It's on the border between Syria and Turkey, on the Mediterranean coast, 5,800 feet above sea level. Today called Jebel al-Aqra, Zaphon known to the ancient world as the site of the palace of Baal. Baal, the primary antagonist of Yahweh in the Bible. Actually, Baal was just a title. When you think about it, this is kind of gutsy. Baal just means Lord. You notice in most of our English translations of the Bible, we translate Yahweh as Lord. Baal's actual name is Hadad. But he got everybody to call him Lord. Coincidence? He was also identified with the ancient Amorite god Amuru, the Hittite god Teshub, the Sumerian god Ishkur, and others. You might also know him by the names Zeus or Jupiter. Mount Zaphon was so important that the word Zaphon in Hebrew actually means the compass point north. And there are verses in the Old Testament when you substitute the proper name Zaphon for the word or the compass point north, the verses take on some surprising new meanings. For example, Isaiah 14. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. You ever wonder what sides of the north meant? Let's look at some more modern English translations. The NIV. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. The New English translation. I will rule on the mountain of assembly, on the remote slopes of Zaphon. The subject of Isaiah 14 in Hebrew, named Hillel ben Shachar, light bringer, son of the morning. The title, which was translated by Jerome as Lucifer, wanted to establish his holy mountain as supreme in the cosmos. Which holy mountain? Zaphon, the holy mountain of Baal. Mountain number 6. This is the prize. Zion, the ultimate prize in the long spiritual war, the mountain that Yahweh has claimed as his own, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. As a mountain, Zion is really not that impressive. It's not even the tallest spot in Jerusalem. But the Hebrew prophets knew its significance. Certainly the rabbis in Israel today know its significance, and I suggest the enemy knows its significance, which is why the Muslim authority there, the Waqf, doesn't want anybody except Muslims on the Temple Mount. But the Hebrew prophets, if you read the Bible carefully, you'll find places in the Bible where they actually compare and contrast Zion with Zaphon and Hermon. Psalm 68, Mount Zion versus Mount Hermon, smackdown. Psalm 68, beginning at verse 15, O mountain of God, mountain of Bashan. Bashan was that area of the Golan Heights, known to the ancient Canaanites, by the way, as the location of the gates of hell. O many-peaked mountain, mountain of Bashan, why do you look with hatred, O many-peaked mountain, at the mount God desired for his abode, yes, where the Lord will live forever? Now, the many-peaked mountain of Bashan is Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is the tallest peak in a chain of mountains, the anti-Lebanon mountains. Now, verse 15 looks a little weird because Mount Hermon was, if there was like an exact opposite to Mountain of God, that would be Mount Hermon. But the Hebrew, Har Elohim, can also be translated, O mountain of the gods. And in this context, that makes more sense. Mountain of the gods, why are you looking with hatred, O many-peaked mountain? Verse 17. After asking why, Mount Hermon looks at the true mountain with jealousy and hatred. Verse 17, the chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary, the tabernacle. You ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train. Psalm 68 is describing a supernatural assault on Mount Hermon by Yahweh and him leading captives away from the conquered stronghold on the holy mountain of El. Now see this about Mount Zaphon in Psalm 48. Psalm 48, his holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great king. The psalmist here is comparing Mount Zion to Mount Zaphon. Mount Zion, as I said, not much of a mountain, 2,400 feet, give or take, and it sure isn't in the far north. It is a comparison between Mount Zion and Mount Zaphon, taking imagery applied to Baal's holy mountain and appropriating it for Yahweh to show that Zion is superior to Mount Zaphon. And this understanding of cosmic north having more meaning than just as a simple point on the compass, could give the Gog-Magog war a slightly different feel. And this is me speculating here. But look at verse 6 of Ezekiel 38. Beth Togarmah, from the uttermost parts of the north with all his hordes. The Hebrew words translated their uttermost parts of the north, Yerikat Sephon. They appear in 3 places only in the Old Testament, and you've just heard all 3. Isaiah 14, referring to Baal's Mount of Assembly. Psalm 48, comparing Yahweh's Mount of Assembly to Baal's Mount of Assembly. And Ezekiel 38, perhaps the origin point, spiritual, if not physical, for the army led by Gog of Magog. And Zion, of course, is where Armageddon will take place. The book of Revelation tells us that the armies of the world will gather there for one final battle before the millennial reign. Many scholars believe this comes from the Hebrew Har Megiddo. But here's the thing. There's no mountain at Megiddo. It's a valley. Also, in Greek translations of Hebrew, it is not uncommon, in fact, it is common, for the letter gamma to represent the Hebrew letter ayin. So the original Hebrew for Mount of Assembly, Har Moed, is translated or transliterated into Har Megiddo. Har Moed makes more sense. Mount of Assembly. Most Old Testament apocalyptic prophecy focuses on Jerusalem and the Mount of Assembly, Mount Zion. That makes more sense. That's where God will live forever. The enemy wants that mountain, especially to keep us off that mountain. Now, Jesus, of course, was fully aware of this struggle. In fact, he equated Baal, when he was accused of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, Baal the prince, with Satan. And interestingly, in the book of Revelation, Jesus calls Pergamon, which was the site of the altar of Zeus that the Nazis took back to Berlin prior to World War II, as the location of Satan's throne. Zeus, Baal, Satan. Here are a few other things that make more sense. When you look at this and the struggle in the sense of the divine council, the conflict with actual evil entities, principalities, and powers who seek to do us harm. I'm assuming you agree with me that the Apostle Paul knew what he was writing about in Ephesians chapter 6. Okay, we're good on that. A big part of Jesus' ministry was casting out demons. And yes, he was casting them out of the victims to restore them to full health, but he was also casting them off his land. Israel is mine. Get off my land. His transfiguration took place on Mount Hermon. I know there are some who say Mount Tabor. It was in the region of Caesarea Philippi, the only mountain in that region, the tallest mountain in that region, Mount Hermon. Coincidence? No. Peter's confession of faith at the foot of Mount Hermon in front of the grotto of Pan, known to the ancients as the gates of hell. Remember Jesus' response when Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God? You are Peter, and on this rock, Mount Hermon, I will build my church, and the gates of hell, the grotto of Pan, will not prevail against it." That makes the hair on my neck stand up. And in Luke chapter 10, Jesus sends out disciples to the places he was about to visit. How many disciples? 70. Coincidence? No. This was another warning. Get off my land. Mountain number 7 in this long spiritual war. I almost overlooked this one, and I really shouldn't because it's responsible for the greatest psyop in human history. This is Jabal al-Nur. Arabic means mountain of enlightenment. It is where Muhammad reportedly received a visitation from something calling itself Gabriel. By the year 2070, there will likely be more Muslims on planet Earth than Christians. Muhammad saw something, but it wasn't from Yahweh. The future of the long war, prophecy is key. Bible prophecy tells us what the future holds. And let me just make an observation here with all due respect, and I mean that very sincerely with all the scholars here this weekend. The fastest way to get Christians, mild-mannered Christians, fussing and fighting is to ask pre, mid, or post. Am I right? Yeah. And it's sad. It doesn't have to be that way. In fact, it shouldn't be that way because even the apostles didn't fully understand the prophecies of Jesus' first coming. Look at Acts chapter 1. Is it at this time you will restore the kingship to Israel? They were still looking for a geopolitical savior 40 days after he was risen from the dead. They still didn't get it. Then, of course, Acts chapter 2 arrives. Holy Spirit, tongues of fire, speaking in tongues. People from all over the world can suddenly understand the gospel message. And by the way, isn't that a beautiful reversal of the Babel story? Coincidence? I suggest that Yahweh, like a good military commander who doesn't share strategy with the enemy, deliberately concealed the prophecies of Jesus' first coming so that the enemy would not clearly understand it. And I think this is a biblical point to make. As Paul explained in 1 Corinthians 2, yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age, or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. Now the word translated rulers is archon, the Greek word archon. It can mean humans or supernatural entities. It's the same word that John used when Jesus described Satan as the ruler, the archon of this world. But we impart a practical and a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, or they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. The principalities and powers thought by sending Jesus to the cross, they were winning. If they had understood his true mission, they would not have sent him to the cross. So, a little grace for the apostles for not understanding. They're only human. We're only human. So, pre, mid, or post, let's be gracious in disagreement, because we probably won't understand it until we're looking back with 20/20 hindsight. Now, that being said, let's look at a few things here. Christians can be roughly divided into three main groups. About 40% of Americans believe we're living in the end times. Among evangelical Christians, it's about 75%. However, according to Barna Group research, only 9% of American adults and only 19% of American evangelicals have a biblical worldview, meaning they accept 6 basic points of Christian doctrine. So in other words, most American evangelicals believe we're living in the end times, but most of them probably don't have any clue of what the end times are supposed to look like. Now consider, Protestant Christians make up a minority of the world's Christians. Only a little more than a third, actually. Roman Catholics are about half. Orthodox churches make up another eighth. So, us premillennial, pre-tribulational believers are in a small minority of Christians around the earth when it comes to trying to understand the end times. Generally, 3 main groups. Premillennials, believing that Jesus will return for his people before he sets up a literal 1,000-year reign. I'm drawn from a literal interpretation of Revelation 20, 1 through 6. Postmillennials reject a literal interpretation of Revelation 20. They put Christ's return after the millennium. The world gets more and more Christianized through our efforts, and at some point, Jesus will then take over from us once we Christianize the world for him. This was a popular belief in the 19th century. Then World War I happened, 17 million died, and that can kind of put the dampers on your enthusiasm and optimism just a bit. 20 to 50 million dead from the Spanish flu. But in the last 30 years, postmillennialism is making a comeback among a small segment of American charismatic Christians. It's the so-called New Apostolic Reformation. They're teaching something called victorious eschatology. The church militant goes forth, conquers the world for Jesus because we have to, you see. He is stuck in heaven until we conquer the world. You laugh. Their plan is something called the Seven Mountains Mandate. I'm going along, I'm putting stuff from the book back in the presentation, forgive me. Seven Mountains Mandate. 7 mountains of culture they believe we have to take over: arts and entertainment, business, education, family, government, religion, and one other. Anyway, it is a classic psyop, frankly, and to be very blunt, dominion theology. The idea that we have to conquer the world is nothing more than Christian jihad. It is not biblical. It can also be anti-Semitic, as Joel Richardson points out in his excellent book, When a Jew Rules the World. If the world has to be Christianized before Jesus can return and the Jews have no role to play, they are nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. Heresy. Sorry, but it is. Amillennialism is officially the position of most of the world's Christians. It's the official view of the Roman Catholic Church. They believe the 1,000-year reign is just a symbolic number. It's underway now, concurrent with the church age. At the end of the church age, whenever that is, Jesus will come back, take over, and set up permanent physical reign. It is the official doctrine of Roman Catholicism, the Orthodox churches, and some of the Protestant denominations, including Lutherans, Methodists, Anglicans. Again, most of the world's Christians officially hold this view. I just have to ask one thing. If Satan is bound during the millennium, or during this millennial period, however many thousands of years it really is, looking at the world, does it look like Satan is bound? One more quick thing. Chris Putnam and Tom Horn, in their most recent book, The Final Roman Emperor, point out that a pseudepigraphal book from the 7th century called The Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius came up with a concept called the Final Roman Emperor. This is not official Roman Catholic doctrine, but there are Roman Catholic teachers who believe it. It basically took Christian eschatology through this messianic Roman emperor into the mix and came up with a brand new doctrine. He'll conquer the world and then hand over his crown to Jesus when Jesus returns. The question, which I don't have an answer to, is how far will the church go if times get bad enough to try to bring this final Roman emperor, the great monarch, to power? I don't know. What Jews believe. I'll summarize as best I can. Please understand, I'm not a scholar of Jewish eschatology or Islamic eschatology, but I will do my best here to summarize. Also, please keep in mind that Jews and Muslims are just as divided amongst themselves about what they believe as we Christians are. But in short, Jews are looking for a man who leads Israel to victory in war, the war of Gog and Magog, and elevates Israel to preeminence over all the nations of earth. Now, they've never really accepted, the rabbis, the idea that the Messiah was a suffering servant. So rather than seeing Zechariah 12:10, him who they have pierced, as the Messiah, I mean, obviously that was Jesus, we can say, looking back with 20/20 hindsight on those messianic prophecies that the apostles just didn't get, so they didn't accept that. So to try to account for that prophecy, they came up with the concept of a second Messiah. There are 2 Messiahs in Jewish eschatology, one from the tribe of Joseph. Messiah ben Joseph arrives first. He's a military leader, leads Israel to victory in the war of Gog and Magog. He falls in battle, dies, at which point Messiah ben David arrives, wins the war, kills the enemy commander, and resurrects the dead, beginning with Messiah ben Joseph. Then comes the final judgment. Messiah ben David judges the nations and their guardian angels, presumably the 70 placed over the nations after the Tower of Babel, and all of them, which would mean us Christians, thrown into Gehenna. What Muslims believe. Would it surprise you to learn that the Mahdi and the Dajjal, their Messiah, roughly, and Antichrist, are not mentioned in the Quran at all? Period. True. What Muslims know about the Mahdi and the Dajjal come from sayings attributed to Muhammad, the Hadith. Now, just as the apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius was created as a response to Islamic expansion in the 7th century, that was when Islam basically conquered all of the Mediterranean world, the Mahdi was created as a response to Pseudo-Methodius. Oh, they've invented this new Messiah, this Roman emperor king. Quick, we need something like that. So they created the Mahdi in response to Pseudo-Methodius. And this bit of 7th century apocalyptic fiction is tearing the world apart today. Pew Research conducted a survey of the world's Muslims in 2012, found 42% of the world's Sunni Muslims, that's about 670 million people, expect the Mahdi's appearance in their lifetime. So sometime in the first half of the 21st century, 670 million Muslims, Sunni Muslims, expect to see the Mahdi. The highest percentage of people, of those expecting the Mahdi's soon return, are perhaps not coincidentally located in the nations that have been occupied by the US military for the last 15 years, Afghanistan and Iraq. I'd say coincidence on that one, but it wouldn't be funny. Anyway, to compensate for the lack of a prophetic hero or villain in their own holy writings, Muslims began collecting and frankly inventing the Hadith in the 8th and 9th centuries. These are sayings attributed to Muhammad, collected more than 100 years after he died. Islamic scholars over the years have had to divide them into 3 categories: authentic, strong, and weak. But there's no universal agreement between Sunnis and Shias over which are which. They've got different groups that they believe, and there are some who don't believe in the Hadith at all. So when we talk about what Muslims believe about the end times, we have to separate Sunni and Shia. First, the Sunnis. And what they believe is key because they, like Christian dominionists, believe they can jumpstart the apocalypse. Sunnis expect the Mahdi to emerge when the armies of Rome, whatever those are, land at either a town in northern Syria called Dabek, which I'm told is the correct pronunciation, Dabek, or at the Amak Valley in southern Turkey. Now, not coincidentally, the Islamic State's official magazine is called Dabek, and their official news agency is the Al-Amak Press Agency. Oh, and maybe not coincidentally, the Amak Valley stretches north from the north slopes of Mount Zafan. Muslim armies defeat the Romans, then the Dajjal, their Antichrist, emerges from the east, oppresses the people for some period of time. It's not clear, depending on which hadith you look at, 40 days, 40 months, or 40 years. Then Isa, the Islamic Jesus, descends from the heavens at Damascus, helps the Mahdi kill the Dajjal. Isa and the Mahdi go to Jerusalem, lead the faithful in prayers. Al-Mahdi will try to defer to Isa, but Isa will insist that Al-Mahdi remain preeminent, and the two will rule earth for 40 years when they'll both die of old age. In Sunni Islam, anyone with enough charisma and enough chutzpah can claim to be the Mahdi. And they have. Throughout history, there are multiple examples of bloody, horribly violent uprisings led by self-styled Mahdis, similar to what we're seeing now with the Islamic State. Now, Shia Muslims have a different view. And this is not a popular opinion I'm expressing here, but I'm resting this on the work of a trusted and accredited scholar of Islamic history and eschatology. So, Shia Muslims are looking for a supernatural savior. That is the key difference which has led to 1,400 years of bloodshed and hatred between Shias and Sunnis. Sunnis follow the caliphate. Shias follow the bloodline of Muhammad. The first caliph was appointed by Muhammad's companions because Muhammad died without leaving a male heir. Shias follow the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law Ali. Shias, and specifically Twelver Shias, which is Iran, they believe the Mahdi is the 12th Imam who went into hiding or occultation in the year 873 at the age of 4. Or so the story goes. There's good reason to believe that he never actually lived and that he was invented by a Shia scholar in Baghdad to keep the sect together. Oh, sure, the last Imam actually, yes, he had a son. You never saw him, but trust me, he's there. But he went into hiding, and he'll come back someday. And that is what Shia, Twelver Shia, believe. It's tragic if it wasn't tearing the world apart. Of the two sects, Sunni Muslims are the much bigger threat. There are more of them, for one thing, 85% of the world's Muslims. But just as significant, the leaders of Iran, the 12 or Shia, really aren't in a hurry to meet the Mahdi, the 12th Imam. You see, and I should preface this by saying that this is not to say that Iran is not a threat to Israel or the West. They are. They are a state sponsor of terror, and we Americans should never forget the 241 American Marines who died in Beirut in 1983. That was an Iranian operation through Hezbollah. But when you study what Shias actually teach, you find that they believe that there is nothing that they or anyone can do to speed up the end of days. Mahdi will appear when Allah wills it, not one heartbeat sooner. They're not even supposed to fight for global victorious jihad until the Mahdi arrives. But I think maybe even more important, human nature. Like the Sanhedrin of Jesus' day, the Ayatollahs in Iran aren't in a hurry to give up their jobs just because the Mahdi happens to show up. I mean, hey, got a nice house, great car, pretty wife. The Mahdi shows up, out on the street. Very much like the Sanhedrin. In fact, an Israeli scholar puts it this way: Shiism in general, and post-revolutionary Iranian Shiism in particular, is not only not messianic or apocalyptic in character, but is in fact the fiercest enemy of messianism found anywhere in the Muslim world or Islamic history. And also because they're supposed to turn over Jerusalem so that the Mahdi and Isa can lead the faithful in prayers, you would assume that the Ayatollahs don't want to turn over a smoking radioactive crater to the Mahdi. He might be a little upset. But anyway, don't overestimate or underestimate the appeal of a big house, nice car, and pretty wife. Once the Mahdi shows up, the Ayatollahs are out of work. But these are not the only psyops throughout history that the enemy has thrown at us. Of course, we could spend the whole conference on aberrant doctrines over the years, heresies, cults, deviations from Christian orthodoxy. I'm not ignoring them, I'm aware of them, but I'm already going to run over time, I can tell. Put a mental asterisk here and read Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults. Here is an end-time scenario that I think is plausible just because of the lack of knowledge of Bible prophecy among Christians and the false prophecies that have been accepted by Muslims and, sadly, our Jewish brothers and sisters. Daniel 11, verses 40 through 45, and again, thank you to Chris White, author of the book False Christ, for laying out this scenario in a way that it made sense to me. The last 6 verses, at the time of the end, last 6 verses of Daniel 11, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north, Zaphan, shall rush upon him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and many ships. He shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land. That's Israel. Tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand. Edom, Moab, the main part of the Ammonites. Now, there's question as to whether the king of the north is the Antichrist, but I think he that enters the glorious land in the following verse is undoubtedly the Antichrist. Note that he is apparently welcomed into the glorious land without resistance. With all due respect to other scholars, I don't see any scenario now or ever in which Israelis welcome an Islamic leader into the glorious land without serious resistance. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape, shall become the ruler of the treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt. News from the east and north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. Verse 45, and he shall pitch his palatial tent between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Which mountain? Zion. Yes, he shall come to his end with none to help him. This reads like a quick summary of any one of the major wars Israel has fought over the last 70 years. Israel attacked from the south, from the north, news from the east and north alarm him, and Israel saved by the superior generalship of this king of the north, the Antichrist. Now, why would the Antichrist go out and destroy these Muslim nations coming against Israel? It sounds cold-hearted, but I think this is what makes sense. Because the Antichrist will try to fulfill Bible prophecy to convince the Jews that he is their Messiah. In the eyes of the enemy, the only useful role Muslims have to play at this point is cannon fodder. Human sacrifice to lure Jews and Christians into accepting him as Messiah. Muslims, and I say this with no joy, but those who have rejected Yeshua and Yahweh are already lost. Amen. They still have time, but those who are sold out are already lost. The enemy doesn't need to waste any effort drawing them in. They're already lost. They'll see this charismatic Israeli leader as their Dajjal. We must attack him. He's destroying the soldiers of Allah. And when he does, the king of the north, a dynamic, charismatic Israeli leader, rises to crush the attack. How would he be viewed in Israel? Messiah. How would he be viewed by American evangelicals, considering that we support Israel more passionately than American Jews? He must be of God, especially dominionists who see their role as the sword of God to conquer the world. He would be a hero. And among Jews, especially Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox rabbis, their expectation of the Messiah's imminent arrival is at a fever pitch. There are respected Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox rabbis saying Messiah is already here. They are saying that the war in Syria, the civil war, there is the war of Gog and Magog. Now, does it fit the template? Does it fit Daniel 11? No, it doesn't. But frankly, for most people, close is good enough. Wow, that must be it. I mean, come on, we all read the internet. How many bad examples of bad prophetic exegesis have you run into? Is President the Antichrist? Why, yes, he must be. And, of course, the final Roman emperor. It's known, it's not a secret, that the Roman Catholic Church has been trying to get control over holy sites in Israel for more than a century. Is it possible that an attack such as this possible scenario on the Holy Land, especially on God's holy mountain, Zion, would that be enough to lead the Pope to declare a just war in hopes of bringing the great monarch to power? Assuming that Christians are still here when the Antichrist is revealed, poor understanding of prophecy and acceptance of extra-biblical prophecy, like Pseudo-Methodius, will lead Jews and some Christians to go to war for the Antichrist. And let's look even, there's even more to it than this. At verse 45, the king of the north, the Antichrist, pitches his palatial tents. He shall come to his end with none to help him. To Jews, this would be Messiah ben Joseph. They expect him to die in this war. And then Messiah ben David arrives, raises him to life. Or maybe he resurrects on his own and he's Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David. King Messiah, Revelation 13, talking about the beast, one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. Messiah ben Joseph, mortally wounded, resurrected, Messiah ben David, the Antichrist. Summing up, Muslims are waiting for the Mahdi, but what he looks like depends on which sect you ask, and which sect within Sunni and Shia you ask. We talked about 12er Shia, there's also 5ers and 7ers, and it's confusing at best. But Sunni Islam, especially radical Mahdism, appears to be the most likely psyop the enemy will use to draw Jews and Christians into a war fighting for the Antichrist. Jews may be susceptible because they are looking for a military, political hero, just as they were in the days of Jesus, just as the apostles were until Pentecost. American evangelicals are vulnerable. Most support Israel, maybe even to a fault. And most know nothing about Bible prophecy, or what they do, they absorb from the fiction aisle at the video rental store. And pardon me if I'm being harsh, but I'm getting a little passionate here, because the really good stuff is coming. For this contingent of American charismatic Christians who believe that we literally need to conquer the world, this leader who rises up and smashes the enemies of Israel would be possibly even the incarnate Christ. Again, more on that whole belief when the book is finished. Roman Catholic Church, not official doctrine, but they're still looking for a day when the final Roman emperor, the great monarch, arises, takes power, shepherds the world to its Christian destiny, and then hands off his crown to Jesus. In a nutshell, thanks to enemy psyops throughout history, as Jesus said, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in my own name, him you will receive. A long war is in progress for God's holy mountain. The enemy has lied throughout history. They've lied about Yahweh. They've lied about themselves. They have lied about us. They've lied about how we get to heaven. They have lied about whether there is a heaven. And the enemy has especially lied about prophecy. And that will lead to much bloodshed and people volunteering to fight for the wrong side before this is all over. And all of this work, the lies, the psyops, for one purpose only. It is to deny humanity our place in the reconstituted divine council on God's holy mountain. 1 Corinthians 6:3. Do you not know that we are to judge angels? Hebrews 1 and 2 make this clear. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read big chunks of these paragraphs. I don't know where I'm at on time, and right now I don't care. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son"? And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." That is our Messiah. But of the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom." And to which of the angels has he ever said, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? That's us. Hebrews 2, skipping to verse 5. Now it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. Again, that would be, yeah. It has been testified somewhere, "What is man, that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man, that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels, but you have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet." Now, in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him, but we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory. And that Greek word sons means sons and daughters. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one origin. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers. And that's us, saying, "I will tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation. I will sing your praise." can you imagine that? There is a day coming where he stands in the congregation, in the midst of the congregation, on the mount of the congregation, the holy mountain of God, and he sings our praises to his brothers. And that is our destiny, and that drives the enemy wild with rage. And that is why they have been trying to deceive, distract, and destroy us for thousands of years. Their time is nearly up, and they know it, and it's only going to get worse because they are getting desperate. We don't know how things are going to play out exactly. That's partly by God's design and partly the enemy trying to confuse us. And Jesus warned us that this deception would fool even the elect if it were possible. And sadly, many will be deceived and fall victim to Satan's final psyop before the end. So brothers, sisters, pray for wisdom, pray for discernment, and look forward to that day when Christ sings your name and welcomes us home.